All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get going? Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this webinar. Um, I'm Martin Payne, CEO of TextUs, and will be your presenter for today. And I'd like to introduce Maggie. Maggie, why don't you go introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Maggie Misovich. I'm VP of Marketing here at TextUs, and I'll be helping Martin kind of field some questions. So feel free to use the Q&A. Anything that we can answer live, we will do that. If there's anything we can't get to, we'll make sure to answer those questions after, send them out. The recording will go out to everyone who's registered. So if you have to drop off, take a phone call, whatever, not to worry, we'll make sure you get the recording afterward. And then the last item is we'll launch a couple of polls throughout the webinar. So feel free to answer those. We'll share results throughout as well. So they'll usually run for a minute or two, and then I'll close them out and we'll share results. So if you see them pop up and are compelled to answer, please do so.
So today's topic is shoot me a text, how market leaders are winning the war on voicemails. And what we want you to come away with is insights and best practices across 5 different industries, where there are some similarities and also some things that are unique to those industries. Best practices on how to optimize your texting and really drive up that response rate versus other media that you're using like voicemail. Before I get into this, I want to give a special shout out to Kyle Mock, who is our lead data analyst, and he's the guy who owns the data, wrangles the data so that we get insights that come out of it, and is really the guy who shouldered the load for the insights that you'll see here. So we'll cover insights across these 5 industries: education, real estate, financial services, staffing and recruiting, and healthcare. And the first 3 industries there are really consumer-oriented industries and use cases. So students, home buyers, and borrowers. And then the last 2 are really more employee-centric use cases and verticals. So staffing and recruiting pretty much speaks for itself. In healthcare, we're talking doctors and nurses, hospitals communicating with doctors and nurses versus communicating with patients, just for clarity's sake in terms of what you see. And then we'll synthesize the insights and also talk about best practices that we glean from the insights for optimizing engagement as you use your texting platform. And Maggie, do you want to talk about the survey that just hopefully popped up in front of everyone's screen?
Yep, we're just trying to get a sense of who all's on the call. So if any of those industries kind of align with your current job function or company, please respond there just so we have an idea. Thanks.
All right, some definitions before we dive into things here. So first of all, when we talk about a user, it's someone that's using the TextUs platform. And actually, I should take a step back. The data that we're showing you here is data that comes from our platform that's been aggregated and anonymized, so that we're just looking at the insights. So a user is someone that uses the TextUs platform to reach out to somebody. When they reach out to somebody, that somebody is a contact. So someone that the user wants to get in touch with. So it's either going to be a consumer, depending on the vertical, or a candidate or employee. And then conversational text message is a text sent to one or a few contacts. So it's not a broadcast message. It's mainly intended for one-to-one, two-way texting. An automated text message is something, typically a templated text message, that gets automatically sent to a group, usually a large group, as part of an automated workflow or a campaign. And then response rate, or the text received from a contact, divided by the text sent by users. And so that's the way we calculate response rate here. So texting, I always like to start off with just a basic understanding of texting. So texting is both a communication and a messaging medium, or I should say a conversation and a messaging medium. So you can obviously send out messages in broadcast fashion and reach out with a lot of people. But really, at the end of the day, the intent of texting is to engage a contact into a conversation with a user or a company. Whereas email is much more traditionally just a messaging medium. It's harder to have a near real time conversation in an email thread, as we all know. So, given that, they actually can be used quite well, and they're very complementary to one another. But when at a certain point in the journey of either a candidate or a customer, you want to engage that person in some kind of a conversation to really improve the relationship that you're having with that person. So the overall response rate that we've got across those 5 industries that are included in these insights is about 38%. Pretty high, right? If you've been around texting for a while, it's really what you'd expect versus a response rate that you would typically see with voicemail, phone, or even email. It's about 10 times the response rate that you would get from those other media. So why is texting a better engagement medium? Well, it's a live medium. I mean, the social pact, if you will, the pact that everyone uses texting by, is that there's someone on the other end that's a real live, breathing human being. And I think that's the allure of texting, and that's the inherent promise that you get when you receive a text message. And so 74% of consumers prefer talking to a real person instead of a bot. So it's not to mean that you can't use a bot or you can't use automation. It just means that you've got to use it with well-intended smaller doses, because, like I said, the inherent fact is there's someone live at the other end. 98% of all SMS messages are read, so that's a really high read rate compared to roughly 20% of emails. SMS marketing messages tend to have about an 8x higher response rate than email. We talked about that. And much lower amounts of spam. I think the mobile carriers are actually doing, and the ecosystem that surrounds them are doing a very good job actually of keeping the SMS ecosystem pretty clean. It's not nearly as spammy as email is. As we start to unpack, though, that average response rate, and this is where I think the insights start to get pretty interesting. Like, you love that 38% response rate. I mean, it's all well, all good, but if you really start to dissect and segment the information, you start to learn that there's actually quite a bit of variation in that response rate. So here we're just looking at those 5 industries using this year's data, and we just broke out users into quartiles. So the top 25%, so that fourth quartile over on the right, that top 25% sees an average response rate of about 85%. And the next one down, the second best quartile in the green, sees about a 53% average response rate. And you can see the quartiles start to dip in response rate over time, or sorry, based on the quartile that you fall in. And some of this has to do certainly with where are you communicating with the contact in the life cycle or the journey of that contact. That context definitely will impact response rate. But what we find is that there are other user behaviors that impact response rate. And those are the things that you can control when you're reaching out to your contacts to drive up a response rate. And that's really what the rest of the presentation is centered on, is what can you control that's going to help your users drive up the response rate with their contacts, really independent of where they fall in their journey. So here's a breakdown of average response rate across the different verticals. And I find it interesting that there's such a difference between what I'll call the consumer-centric verticals in real estate, financial services, and education, versus the more employee-centric or candidate-centric industries and staffing in hospitals and healthcare. So pretty significant. So I think the natural question is, well, why? Like, what is it about these industries that drives the variation in response rate? Well, one of the big factors that we found was the mix, if you will, of conversational, mostly one-to-one texting. So it's literally more of a conversation is what we're talking about here, versus automated texting, which is going to be less personal and it's going to be one-to-many types of text messages that go out. So look at the mix. So the consumer-oriented industries have a much higher mix of conversational texting. So if you look at financial services, real estate, and education, I mean, folks, the users there are no less than 60% in education, but in lending, like financial services, insurance, and real estate, I mean, they're pushing like 3/4 to 80% of their text messages that go out are conversational in nature. The more staffing or employee-centric industries that we have in our data set are much closer to 55-45. So they weight more towards the automated versus the conversational. And so again, peeling the onion back a bit here, this is why a big reason why the response rates overall by industry vary so much is the response rate when you look at conversational versus automated texting, the response rate difference between conversational and automated ranges anywhere from 2 times greater, like in real estate. Real estate's 2x, a little bit more than 2x greater on the conversational side, versus, in financial services, it's more like 5x. So really high multipliers of response rate of conversational versus automated. It is dependent on what vertical you're in, the magnitude of that multiplier. But in general, conversational texting is going to generate a much higher response rate than automated texting. And when you combine that with a higher mix for a certain industry, that's to a large degree why you see certain industries with higher mixes of conversational texting see higher response rates as an industry. So that's key insight number one, and something you can control as a user or a would-be user, someone who's maybe looking to use texting as a platform. That's a controllable, right? That's a best practice that you can educate your users on is, hey, let's make sure, even though automated texting is easier, it actually makes it harder at the end of the day because you have to cycle through so many more contacts, or the contacts that you've got in your funnel just aren't going to convert at as high of a rate if you were using a higher mix of conversational texting. So now let's look at another controllable here, which is message length. We did a webinar last month that looked at just staffing and recruiting, and you can see those results here actually in the darker blue. You can see that in the staffing and recruiting world, there's a pretty big jump in response rate if you keep your message length at 100 characters or less. It's a pretty significant multiple of response rate versus 100 characters or more. And interestingly enough, like hospitals are even less tolerant of long messages. So if you've got to get a hold of a doctor or nurse, boy, you need to make sure that that text message is super short, because the fall off once you get above 100 characters is really steep. Now, contrast that with the consumer-oriented verticals of real estate, financial services, and education. Those contacts are a bit more tolerant of longer messages, meaning you can get away with messages of 100 characters or more. There still is a fall off in response rate, but it's not as great as what we see with the employee or candidate specific verticals. So shorter is better in general, although the magnitude differs by industry. Now let's take a look at the number of messages that you have to send out in order to get a response. So there's not much difference here by vertical. In general, 75% of your responses will come after the first text message. Will respond after the first text message that you send out there. I think what's insightful here, though, is that there's a bit of a tail, as you can see. Like you get a little bit more response rate at your second message, and then a little bit more at your third. And if we were to just sum up those incremental responses that you get in message 2 and message 3, it's in the ballpark of another 20% of your responses. So said another way, if you don't get a response after your first message and you send another message and then a third message, you can increase your overall response rate by about 20% by following up after that first message. And that's really regardless of the industry that you're in. So now we get into the meatiest part of the webinar here, where we take a look at the content that gets sent out on first message. And we structure the content, or we cut the content by, does the content have text only? Does it have a link or does it not have a link? Does it have an image or not? Does it have an emoji or not? Because those are some of the controllables that we have as writers of text messages. And just by looking at this here, and again, this is first message only that you send to a contact. What stands out is text only. If you're sending first message, I mean, text only has a significant increase in response rate versus things that messages that include things other than text. And then the other insight here is if that message has an image as well, the image bearing text versus those that don't contain images also see a higher response rate on the first message if you include an image, which honestly is a little bit counterintuitive to us perhaps. But if you send a link or an emoji, for example, that might be seen as a little bit too risky on first message, which is why you actually see the decrease in response rate if it's got a link or an emoji in that first message. And this is aggregated across all the verticals that we're talking about. So now if we take a look
Looks like we might be a little frozen here. So let me do some quick troubleshooting and make sure we can get back up and running. Hold tight, please. Apologies, team. Looks like we lost Martin here. So let me shoot him a note quick and see if we can't get back going here shortly. Hang tight. While we're waiting for Martin to get back on, I'm going to go ahead and launch another poll just to get an idea of how everyone's currently communicating, whether you primarily are using text in your workflows, if it's a combination of text, email, phone, kind of how you're seeing some of the response rates come through with those communication mediums as well. So feel free to answer that. We'll share the results here shortly. And hopefully we can get some of the technical difficulties squared away in the meantime. Looks like we had a loss of internet. So Martin, just let me know he's rebooting. We'll give everyone a few more minutes on the poll and should be restarting here shortly. Appreciate everyone's patience. This is, a blessing and a curse with the Zoom times we're living in. Sometimes technology can fail us once or twice, but hopefully we won't keep you hanging too much longer. I'm going to go ahead and share results on this poll. Sounds like most on the call are currently using a texting service, whether with us or someone else. And it is kind of part of a greater communication strategy. So, there is a lot of usage still with phone, email, and text on their own, but a combination of all the above, it seems to be the most common with at least those that are on the call. In terms of best engagement, these are numbers that we've shared pretty regularly. Text tends to get the better engagement, but there are some that are still seeing good engagement with phone and email as well. So, text being a real-time medium, we'd like to see that overall the best response is coming through text. But we also understand that there's, certainly a use case there for the tried and true methods in the way of phone and email. So Martin's back.
Sorry about that, everybody.
Yeah.
That may have been the most unfortunate loss of a wireless access point ever. So thanks for bearing with me there. I had to do a hard reboot there. It just decided to quit on me.
Cool.
All right, and I'm gonna go video, just video less, just to tax the network a little bit less here. All right, so just to finish off this slide, across industry, text only, generally speaking, gets higher response rate on first message than other content that you might include in the message. So now if we look at whether the message has a link or not, links, generally speaking, perform on par with other messages that don't have links, or they perform worse. And so with, the employee-centric verticals are a little bit more tolerant of having links in there, maybe because they might expect it from the phone number that's sending the message. But generally speaking, on the consumer side of things, they're very leery of links in the first message. And I think that stands to reason too. We're all consumers here. And if we get a first text from a phone number, and it includes a link, I think we're very suspicious of that. And the data here just bears that out. And if we move to whether the message has an image in it or not, the imagery tends to do quite well, actually, in staffing, real estate, and education. Image in your first message, really, it 2x's or greater the response rate versus messages with other contents in it. The one exception being healthcare. And again, the healthcare use cases to doctors and nurses. When it comes to doctors and nurses, you pretty much just want to stick to text. That's the moral of the story there. And to tie this back to the data that we saw earlier, stick to text and keep it super short, 100 characters or less. And it stands to reason given the clinical nature of their job. I mean, information's important, but it's got to be quick, to the point, digestible, and then you're done. And then over to the emoji. The emoji, much like the link in your first message, is in some cases will have the same response rate as ones without an emoji, or worse. The only difference here is with financial institutions, where we've got an outlier where an emoji seems to be on par, maybe slightly better on your first message. So use those sparingly, I would say. So we're here at the end, and what we want to do is just talk about what are the implications and best practices. What should you do with the insights that we just shared? Well, first and foremost, just remember that maybe the one of the biggest levers at your disposal is just how much do you conversationally text versus send text through automation. Biggest gains there are 2x to 5x response rate. So the best practice here would be make it the majority, if not the vast majority of your texting. Make it 1-to-1 if you really want to drive the increase in response rate. And if you don't get a response after your first message, send a second and a third message to gain about another 20% bump in your response rate. If texting to employees and staff, keep the messages short. Boy, especially if you're in healthcare. Consumers are more tolerant of longer messages, so you've got a little bit more latitude there if you're in a consumer-oriented industry. Message content matters for sure, and as we've learned here in your first send to context, go with text only or text plus imagery. That really carries the day to increase your response rate. And be selective in using links and emojis. As we found, really not recommended for that first text, but once you've established engagement after that first text, then presumably including links and emojis, won't impact response rate, or at least not as much. And remember, we say this everywhere. We didn't have a slide on this because it's a kind of a universal truth. Texting is a near real-time messaging medium because people expect a live human being on the other end. That's the implied social pact when you use texting. So 70% of responses occur within 2 hours. So use a texting platform with apps that allow you to text from anywhere in your workday or your workflow. So if you're moving around, that text platform should give you a mobile app that allows you to respond, while you're out and about. It should also provide you with an app that allows you to respond and message while you're working within your enterprise software system, typically an applicant tracking system, a CRM system of some sort where you're engaging with customers. There should be an in-app window that allows you to engage in texting while you're using that enterprise system. And then lastly, it should have a web app as well, because that's also a universal way that people engage with their texting software. And then last but certainly not least, you really need to ensure that your users have the training that they need to use the platform and feel comfortable using the platform. Because if they don't feel comfortable using the platform, they're going to default to using phone and email. And phone and email, as you saw, has are really 10x less responsive as a medium. And so to make sure that your organization as a whole is getting that 7.5 to 10x response rate improvement, you really need to have as many users as possible using texting. And so to be sure to partner with a provider that has great trainers or training resources so that it makes that change from phone and email easy, right? To make the transition over into texting.
Martin, we did have one question come up a couple of times, and it probably would be a good idea to answer live, just to clarify when you say text plus image in a message, what that entails.
Sure. It would be uploading like a JPEG into your message, like pulling, like if you're just texting someone from your personal phone, it'd be like selecting from the photo library there an image that you would include in that message. Over the way that looks over in a platform like TextUs, you would upload from the photo library either on the computer that you're using or on the phone that you're using. If you're using our mobile app, it looks and feels very similar to using like iMessage or Android messaging.
Great. If there are any other questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box now, or the Q&A box, excuse me. Can also do a little live Q&A if you want to just do a raise of the hand, use that raise hand button. We can do some back and forth that way. Otherwise, we'll give it a few minutes in case there's anything lingering, and go from there. Looks like we have one from Elisa. I'm just going to allow folks to talk, Martin, and then we can kind of do these live if that works.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. Okay, Elisa, if you want to unmute yourself, go for it.
I was on the line last month on the one for staffing and recruiting, but I didn't catch most of the webinar. Is there someone directly I should contact to get that recording?
Yep, I'm your person, so I will take your name down here and then make sure you get that recording from the last one.
Okay, thanks, Maggie.
Okay, let's see. It looks like Ed has a hand up. I just unmuted you, Ed.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have a question that I'm not sure. I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask this or not, but I was really interested when I saw this this webinar was going to be given, because we've been looking at texting. I'm a director at Persona. We do staffing and a lot of outsourcing, and I've been working really hard trying to pivot with the changes in the way the market responds to different contact methodologies. And I want to use text. My big problem has been I have directories where I can find emails or I can find landlines. But my biggest problem with implementing a texting step in our process is that we don't have cell phone numbers, or we don't know if the number we have is a landline or a cell phone. And so maybe this is like a really elementary question and you may be rolling your eyes, but I haven't been able to find a solution to this. How do you usually, is there a way that you go about finding those numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually one we get a lot. And it's one of those subtle things that provides high value add to our to customers in general. So what we do is we bump the phone number that we get from, really, it's typically your system of record, the ATS or the CRM, and we'll bump that up against the database and do a lookup to see whether it's a mobile number or a landline. Not all systems do it, because folks might think that a phone number is a phone number is a phone number, but we have a lot of customers that ask that question. So good question.
So we use Salesforce. So you'd be able to help us identify what phone numbers in Salesforce are actually landlines and which ones we can text to. Is that right?
That's right. So we have an integration with Salesforce where we recognize pages in Salesforce that have contact information on there, and we'll recognize a phone number and do a lookup on that phone number.
Okay, great. Thank you. That answers my question.
Yeah, thanks, Ed.
All right. Let's see, maybe I think we've got one more. Elaine had a hand up. I just unmuted you, Elaine, if you had a question. Maybe not. Okay.
Elaine, you're still on mute, by the way, if you want to answer or ask a question.
All good, she says. Okay.
Okay.
Looks like that's all the hands we have up for now. We'll linger for a little bit longer in case there's anything else, but I think we've kind of gotten through all the questions. I did take everyone's name that asked for that webinar from last month. If you would like to be included on that second send, you can also send me an email. It's just Maggie, MAGGIE @textus.com. And I'll be sure to get you the recording of that last month's webinar as well. But everyone today will get this recording so long as you're registered in here.
Thanks a lot, guys. As you can tell, I nerd out on this stuff. And so if you want to talk about it afterwards, be happy to have a conversation with you guys, but really appreciate you spending part of your Friday with us.
All right.
Thank you very much. It was great information.
Thank you. Bye-bye.